Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator from Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very excited for this event as we celebrate the launch day for both Freya Marske with A Restless Truth and Everina Maxwell with Ocean's Echo. Both of these books have signed book plates waiting for them at Gibson's Bookstore. For you, Freya, Everina, thank you for joining us. Happy launch day.
Happy launch day. It is great to share launch day for these books, which have a lot in common.
They do.
Launch evening for you, Freya. I think you're just past launch day. You're on the other side of the world. You're in the future for us.
Yes, it is the day after launch day, technically in the States, but for me, it's great because I wake up to all of the launch day excitement.
I love this. Excellent. So we are so excited for this event. When the publicist sent us the email, my boss was CC'd to it, and my boss said, "Hey, I think we know these names. Do we know these names?" And I read the email and it said, "Would you like to be the launch day virtual event for Freya Marske and Everina?" And the noise that I made was like a choking bird, I was like, yes, we absolutely do. We were so excited. We have been insufferable in the store talking about this, myself, Ryan, Joe, our coworkers. We're so excited for this. So thank you for joining us. To our audience members, put your questions in the chat sidebar. We're going to try and keep this spoiler free. We're going to do our best. We're going to do things in vague terms. If we do let anything slip, we're going to be editing that in after so that nothing gets put up on YouTube. But we're going to leap into this. Freya, Everina, I want each of you to give me an elevator pitch on your books to get us started. Freya, you're in the future. You start us off.
All right. So A Restless Truth is the second book in the Last Binding trilogy. It is a magical murder mystery set on an ocean liner that is definitely not the Titanic. And it has a sapphic romance between, I suppose, a human force of chaos who hates liars and a beautiful illusionist whose entire existence is a deception. And Elizabeth made the mistake of telling us that she is a theatre kid, and this is possibly the most theatre kid book that I could have written, if that's a selling point for you.
I have read it and it's incredible. Both me and Freya have read and screamed over each other's books. So briefly to introduce the other one in this conversation, Ocean's Echo. So this is a standalone space opera. It is about two soldiers in the space military in some far-off planet where some people are born with psychic powers. And these two soldiers are forced to mind bond so that one of them can be controlled. They kind of go into this and decide, no, actually, we don't want to do it. So we are going to fake this mind bond. And that definitely doesn't lead to them falling in love or anything, and they definitely then don't have to stop a war, have many further adventures, but that is Ocean's Echo. It is also a chaos order pairing, which I think both of us have this central force of chaos in the book, in the driver's seat, driving the plot all over the place, and it's a lot about the collision with this other character.
I agree. I'm trying to think about how Violet would react to being described as a force for order. And I think she looks upon herself as a generous improvisational partner. I think she's a very yes and kind of person when it comes to the plot, which is terrible when it comes to what is good for Maud to have that kind of person around, but very good for driving plot, I have to say.
Yeah. And I think this almost gets us into what I know we both wanted to talk about, which was the kind of intersection between tropes and relationships and science fiction and fantasy. And particularly, so yes and is not kind of an official trope or anything, as far as there are official tropes. But my God, is that very, very central to all the dynamics I enjoy. This whole thing of, I am going to not exactly enable this person, but person A comes up with something and then person B like accidentally tops it because of who they are, and then person A accidentally tops it again, and that's how the plot goes. Like neither of them are stopping the other, they are just sending the other in weirder and weirder directions. Does that resonate with how you think of the plot?
Yes, and like it's been very different to write this because book one had a lot of plot in the situation, whereas the characters were a little bit less plot generative in themselves. Whereas I think you could put Maud into any kind of situation whatsoever and she would generate plot just by being who she is. And when I was thinking about how the romance goes and what are the romance tropes that are actually in this pairing, I wanted to do something quite deliberate with the rake wallflower or the rake ingenue trope of somebody who's more worldly and experienced and has both more life experience, more sexual experience, and somebody who's just starting out and is sort of innocent and sheltered in some ways, but is still a force of chaos in her own way. And the way I could play with that trope and weave it into the murder mystery and into the fantasy plot was one of probably quite a difficult thing, but one of my favorite things to do because of what it allowed me to do with the character notes along the way. It was so much fun.
Yeah, no, what I particularly like about Maud and Violet is that they have this they do have this kind of rake ingenue vibe, but in a way that's, they have that as their first layer, and then the story is about them kind of scraping back that first layer to what are you when you can't kind of present almost what society thinks of you. What are you at the next layer? I
think I tweeted at one point that I was doing a rake ingenue or a rake ingenue speed run where both people in the pairing were mistaken about which one of them they were. And so what you see is this wonderful mirroring journey where they think they are playing a particular role in this relationship. And through the slow stripping away of layers, as you put it, and the slow development of intimacy through being forced into a fantasy plot, they begin to discover that actually maybe they are more suited to the other role in the relationship. And there's all these layers of performance and play that I had so much fun with when doing that relationship.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah, the rake character is an interesting kind of a trope because in a way, so for Ocean's Echo, in a way I was starting with that kind of stereotype for Tennel, who is the central character. Tennel is the kind of force of nature. He is the nephew of a very senior planetary politician. He has a kind of psychic powers, and he has mind reading, which is very socially looked down on. So he has the wrong kind of psychic power for various historical reasons. And he is at the start, he is kind of resisting being put in a box. He is kind of partying it up. He is making every single bad decision he can possibly make. And then very, very early on, so sort of in the first chapter, he basically hits a wall. And I find the kind of rake character really interesting when they hit a wall and they can't do what they want. They can't do pretty much anything they want. They are suddenly in a situation they did not want to be in, and they are finding kind of the bedrock of their personality. So so in Ocean's Echo, you have Tennel immediately going to so immediately he gets conscripted into the army. So immediately he is very, very constrained in what he can do. He is very constrained in where he can go and what his goals can be. And he is he is on a fast track to a mind bomb, which he absolutely doesn't want. And I find that the best part of that is then watching this total chaos character find every single crack in the path that they're on and go in every single direction and cause as much trouble as they can possibly cause. And it's that kind of gleeful chaos, the way you have the kind of rake skill set, but you don't really have but you don't have that control. So it's someone kind of bouncing around.
I love Tennel so much. And that's what you do with one of those characters who's defined themselves with the freedom to do what they want. Is you just shove them into a situation where suddenly they can't do what they want.
Yeah.
And then you give them a romance arc, which is about discovering what a kind of freedom really is. And maybe it looks a bit different than what they thought it had at the beginning.
Yes, because that's the core of a lot of romance tropes I enjoy, which is you're growing into something. Like you're not really becoming someone else, you're becoming yourself, but in a way that is more true to yourself, in a way that is often more sustainable and doing less of the harm that you've been doing at the start, or at the start of your arc to yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I really see in Violet as well.
Yeah, Violet's an interesting one. I don't want to give away too much of her backstory because so much of Violet's story is also the reader finding out more about who she is. So she is someone who is very careful about how much of herself she shows to the world and what exactly she shows to the world, because she is an instinctual performer. And I think the turning point in the relationship that she has with Maud is when Maud realizes and confronts her with the fact that actually Violet has given her nothing real. She has, every time Maud has asked a question, she has been deflecting or performing or turning it around, and Maud actually knows very little about the person underneath the sparkle. And that had to be the turning point for their relationship. And it's this beginning of an opening up for Violet, of realizing that she's not actually sure who she is beneath all those layers. And though, even though Maud is younger and is the one who's having the more obvious self-discovery voyage, and it's a literal voyage, we are not being subtle with the metaphors here, Violet is the one who actually has the most to learn about who she is underneath everything else.
Because in a way, Maud is expecting to learn something when she goes on her literal voyage, which I hadn't clocked that. Metaphors over my head. Yeah, in a way, Maud is expecting to learn things, whereas Violet is expecting to stay the same. Which is...
Yeah, and she's reacting to the situation that she's running away from. And she thinks that the best way to do that is to just completely keep her walls up and not show the truth of herself, because she doesn't know what it is and she doesn't want to get hurt again, which of course is where you start a romance with a rake character. You give them a secret hurt and everything is a front and they have a heart of gold, but sometimes you just want to play along the way.
Yeah. No, that is the joy of that type of character. Or in the case of Tennel, very much a being certain that what you have inside you is not really worth other people's time, not really worth other people's attention, and you have that front to try and convince both yourself and other people that it is what happened, this kind of insecurity. I think that's it's very much a okay, so we talked about not comparing works to Discworld. A very perceptive reviewer did in fact point out that this romance was basically Moist von Lipwig and Captain Carrot. And you know what? I'm gonna own that.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. But I want you to tell me more about why you did the telepathic soul bond trope, and not necessarily why you did it, but why you decided to explore that, especially for a character, as you point out, like Tennel, where the whole point of him is he doesn't want anybody to see the truth of who he is.
Why did you commit this crime, Everina? Yeah. The linchpin of this whole story is this concept that between someone who can read minds, which is again socially looked down upon and very rare, and someone who can control minds, which is socially very acceptable and quite common, it is possible in rare circumstances to force a telepathic link whereby the one who can control mind is basically controlling the mind reader. So you have a telepathic pairing that is kind of unequal, and because this is a very military society, it is basically used and abused by the military because they need some of the reader powers. So you have this telepathic soul bond at the heart of the story. Telepathic soul bonding is, of course, a trope with a really long history. Star Trek comes from there. Well, I don't know if it comes from there, but maybe first popularized in certain episodes of Star Trek. But we've been doing it all the time, and especially fandom has been doing it all the time. And the idea is that a telepathic soul bond kind of stands in for attraction, stands in for relationships, stands in for love. Often telepathic stories, the soul bond be the culmination. That is when you are in a kind of proxy romantic relationship. I think this is a really interesting trope, and I have an awful lot to say about it. The one thing I will say is it is not a spoiler to say this book has a largely happy ending. I write in the romance genre, romance has happy endings, romance has a crossover. But I do have an awful lot to say about the complexities of even introducing the concept of a psychic soul bond, because you have this thing of back to the mortifying awareness of being known, the idea that actually being known is to be very vulnerable, going back to the rake character. And you have the if you know someone, can you become aware of them in ways that no one else is? And is that romantic? Which is not a question I necessarily, I think, answer in this book in a definitive, one way or the other. Is it romantic, or is it quite scary? Is it quite scary to be vulnerable? Is it a good idea to be that vulnerable? This bond is used to control people. We all have boundaries up as part of our normal kind of human being life. Is it a good idea to take down those boundaries? someone who is known for making very healthy relationship decisions, aka Tennel. Is it a good idea for him to be anywhere near this kind of concept? But mainly it's but at the start of the book, it's very much you have this concept and it gets explored in various ways. But at the start of the book, we are using it in the fake dating concept, and that's really very early on, and that's in the pitch for the book. So it is very much we are going to pretend to do this, and we are going to do things around it, because of course Tennel can read minds. He can read Surik's minds to some small extent, and Surik can control Tennel. And when they are forced to interact with each other in these ways, that is obviously a very fraught thing for both of them. So you get these kind of almost like a romance arc, but with soul bonding as proxy for romance. I've used a bunch of things as proxy for romance over the years. I don't think I'm going to stop. I think that's where I come in the kind of intersection of science fiction and romance. And I think it's quite common in that we are both writing in this interesting intersection of science fiction, fantasy, and romance, which has recently become a lot more popular. And I think the way in which that is quite interestingly done is when you have a superhuman ability that is used for connection rather than just for kind of individual heroism. And of course, just talked a lot about how in Ocean's Echo that is telepathy and mind control and soul bonding and the awareness of another mind. I would say particularly in A Marvellous Light, I'm also seeing that kind of magic used for connection. I'm seeing particularly magic used for aesthetics, which is appreciated by the other person, which forms that mental connection. Does any of that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, and I was having a conversation about this recently with the point of the illusion magic that Violet has in A Restless Truth. So she spent a lot of time working in the magical theatre scene in New York. And so her predominant magical gift is in the production of illusion. And obviously there is a thematic layer of it being a performance and it being another layer of unreality between herself and the world. But as the romance progresses, it becomes not just a symbol for a lie, which is the main barrier between them and the internal conflict of the romance, but it becomes a symbol of the greater world. So Maud wants to discover things. She wants to know everything. She wants to see everything. She wants the freedom that she didn't have when she was growing up. And what Violet can give her is to show her wonder and to show her beautiful things. And there's a scene where Maud is sad and in a bad mood, and Violet thinks, right, I'm going to cheer her up and I know what will do this. And she gives her a private magical illusion show. And in my head, it's the equivalent of my partner has had a bad day. I'm going to bake them a cake. I'm going to sit them down and make them a cup of tea. It's an act of sharing your gift as an act of self-sharing. And I think for someone like Violet, that was a really powerful moment because it was a shift from performance as job to performance as intimacy.
Yeah, I love that scene. And in a way, I think there's particularly with magic and with that kind of, I think that's quite important in the kind of opening the sense of wonder in a way, because in any romance, it is a very, very romantic thing for the other person to open up the world in a way you have never seen. And like, we don't need magic for that. That's something that happens in the mundane world as well. But it is a very vivid proxy for that, to be in love with a wizard, either a space wizard or a fantasy wizard, and for them to be like, here is this wonderful thing that you have never seen, I am introducing into your life, and vice versa. And that kind of opening of new boundaries.
Absolutely. Staring at our outline, what do we want to do next?
Shall we check chat? I'm going to briefly check chat. We're taking official Q&A at the end, so we will look at the Q&A at the end. But yeah,
that's all right. Well, I mean, we obviously, when we first sat down to talk about this, there was a little bit of a joke between us many months ago of all the different ways in which these books are quite similar and all the things that they had in common. And I think two of them that we wanted to talk about, let's start with shenanigans on a boat.
Can we also say the thing that the way in which they are no longer similar, in that we both had the exact same structure of the first line. And luckily I was later in the editing process for Freya, so I read A Restless Truth and I was like, my first line reads almost exactly like yours, I'm gonna have to change it. So now Freya got the three things first line, and I changed mine. But yeah, no, so the one of the reasons that we were excited to have this conversation is because these books share a lot. Particularly okay, it's actually the journey trope. That's all it is. They are going on a journey. This is the very, very core concept of science fiction and fantasy. It's just very, very noticeable because Freya's book is entirely set on a boat, and mine is mainly set on quite small spaceships. So there are
proximity.
many...
It's about the proximity.
Yes. So this is into, you are forced into space with someone else who you do not necessarily like, who you do not necessarily trust, and that then pushes the character development along. Did that make it easier, Freya? Did that make it harder for you to write? Like, was that a crutch, or was that a problem?
I mean, it was a lot of fun. You can't escape your feelings if the alternative is leaping overboard or spacing yourself. You are stuck with your feelings and with this other person. And A Restless Truth takes place in a very short time span. So that physical proximity was very helpful in fast forwarding the events of what has to happen, because they have a 6-day period, which is the length of a transatlantic voyage at the time on an ocean liner of the time. And so I knew that was how much time I had for the plot and also for the romance. And if you have this forced proximity and also a forced teaming, putting them on the same side of a quest or something that they have to do together, then like you can get to know somebody very well if you are doing nothing but do a shared group project with them for 6 days.
Yeah, that's the shared group project is a good way of putting it. I think what I found was, so you've got kind of two people who are, like, I would say, wary strangers, and then become more than that. And I've got two people who see each other as problems. So I've got Tennel, who sees Surrett as an outright threat, and Surrett, who sees Tennel as, oh God, I am in, like, I don't know what my orders are. Something seems dodgy. I am very nervous about this. I don't want to do this. I don't want to be around this person. I don't want this person to be my problem. They are immediately shoved together, basically locked in a cabin. They are in a military environment. And what you get there is a kind of pressure cooker. And I really enjoy that thing of, actually, this other person, it's not that the other person's presence is bad for them. It's that the other person's presence is ramping up the pressure on a crack that is already there. So events are already quite bad. They're already having, like, their individual mental reactions to them. And what that forced proximity does is make people crack. And then you move to the next stage of the plot, the relationship, of whatever you are doing. But you have to get through that wall to, okay, we don't have anyone else. You are not the person I would pick. Like, you are not my first choice for not Surrett's first choice, and Tennel's first choice will always be himself. But something has to go, and we would rather take it on our own terms. That kind of, it wouldn't happen, right? It's that thing you said about fast forwarding it. It wouldn't happen if it weren't.
And you really pressure cooked them. Like, you made them share a cabin immediately. I was that mean.
I had a space military behind me, right?
Exactly.
You just had a boat full of rich people.
There's only one tiny cabin with a bunk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like 6 feet wide. Yeah. And you have the other interesting thing is side characters, right? So actually, the issue with putting it on a transport ship is you actually have a lot of people to deal with. Like, you can't get them away to the wilderness for 2 days like I did in my last book. Like, you always have several thousand people in the very, very immediate vicinity. I found that in a way quite difficult until I had identified, like, who were the important people there to bring in. But, like, how did you go about sort of picking your side characters? Did you already know who they were? Was it how?
I knew who the major side characters were going to be because I had to set up some stuff for book 3. So this is the difference between writing something that's the middle book in a trilogy and writing a standalone, is that I had to know where I was going with it, and especially with the major secondary characters. So I had to do quite a lot of setup in book 2 for what's going to happen in book 3. That said, it was a lot of fun to play with even the minor supporting characters, because I was thinking of it like an Agatha Christie novel, because in many ways it is a fairly classical mystery, like the mystery on a ship. You know, that's an Agatha Christie
Almost a lot of room.
thing.
Yeah.
You know, locked room, you know, it's like the Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile. Like, it's, you are on a journey, you can't get away, you are surrounded by strangers, someone is dead. Like, that's such a great story setup. There's a reason it's popular. And so I was doing that. And what I love about the best murder mysteries is that sense you have that every bit player is in the middle of their own story. And so I really enjoyed picking out secondary characters and tertiary characters, even the ones who don't have very much page time, and really giving you a sense that they have their own preoccupation. They're on their own journey. They're coming from somewhere, they're going to somewhere. They have their own secrets. And of course, part of the fun of mystery is red herrings in the form of everybody has a secret. What is it? Is it relevant to the plot or not? So that was a really fun way to add a lot of color to the background and to make it a more lively story. But playing with the secondary characters who are really part of that core team of we have to do something together, that was the very deliberate active setup, but it was a lot of fun because the two characters that I chose to be the predominant secondary characters play off Maud and Violet in really interesting ways. So you have Lord Hawthorne, who we meet in A Marvellous Light very briefly, plays a much bigger role
But very
in A Restless
memorably.
Truth, much against his will. This is really his personal journey of resisting the hero's call to fuck it, I guess I'm involved. That's more or less the journey that he goes on.
Maud kind of lassoed him and it's kind of
Basically,
dragging him along the deck.
Dragged along. Yeah, he is the person in the group project who just sits in the corner and is like, if I get a bad grade, I'll just pay someone to change it. And by the end of it has become reluctantly embroiled and really cares about the details of the project. And then you have another secondary character who I'm not going to spoil because nobody's met him yet. He's not in A Marvellous Light. But he has certain qualities about him that make him a really good foil for the other three characters and a bit different to the characters who've turned up in the series so far. So writing all of the scenes where the four of them were plotting and planning was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I have fond memories of these characters. I read this book some months ago now, but I've been very good.
Yeah, and of course you surrounded Surit and Tenel with their own little, chaos family.
Chaos family. That's a good way of describing it. Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of often characters in romances may have some come from very healthy family backgrounds, but some I think especially in queer romances will often come from family backgrounds which are not as supportive. Not necessarily about them being queer, because we are both writing queer norm worlds, but there will often be like a found family is like a big trope in I think that has been quite popular recently, and I think goes way back to, I remember reading Tamora Pierce and the Circle of Magic, which was a very, very formative book for me about shockingly 4 teenagers who mind bond. We are seeing a pattern here, but it's also about 4 teenagers who basically lost their families and then become each other's found family. And so ever since that, I've always been quite interested in the idea of found family. And I think when I first was like, okay, so I'm writing a book about spaceships, my first thought was, okay, so this is a spaceship crew found family book, which is like one of the core tropes of modern science fiction. It's in Firefly, it's in a lot of TV shows. I found that didn't work. And largely the reason it didn't work was because Surit and Tenel are such big personalities that they took over the entire book. Like it's 140,000 words long. I needed most of that to deal with all the stuff that they had going on, largely in their heads. So I found I just did. So when I didn't have room for an ensemble story, this is not an ensemble story. But what I eventually realized is I would have to pick out just a couple of people from Surit's crew, basically, and say, okay, these 2 people are important and they're going to represent the rest of the crew, the rest of the people they're surrounded with. And that actually works really well, because then you can figure out that you have crew members beyond those, but they are kind of relaying their existence through these characters who do have very strong personalities. And so I have Istara and Basavi, who are kind of Surit's lieutenants, and they are they're also kind of an order chaos pairing. And what I found was it is useful for secondary characters to, in some ways, reflect the main issues of the main characters while also having their own personalities. So you've got people who are anti-authority, or you have people who don't really question authority, and they are, you know, in the first bit, the main character also sees them as, this person is like a reflection of me, either in, you know, a congruent way or in an opposite way. And then I like that bit sort of later in the book where the main character hits something about the side character they didn't expect, because actually the side character, as you said, Freya, is not there for the main character. Like, they have their own stuff going on, and they've had their own stuff going on throughout the entire book. It's just the main character didn't notice it because one of them is trying to make things go right, and the other one is like super obsessed with himself. They are. I really enjoy that bit where you're like, oh, okay, actually these two have had something going on outside that the entire time. And I think that's something we've both got.
You've made me feel a lot better about the length of the first draft of book 3.
How long is the first draft of book 3, Freya?
I'm not going to mention any exact numbers, but it's quite a bit longer than the first drafts of books 1 and 2. And the reason for that is because book 3, I'm trying to think, I think in final form, A Marvellous Light was about 115,000 and A Restless Truth is just over 120. I think my first draft of book 3 clocked in at over 140,000. And it's because, number one, because I'm an overwriter in drafting, and that's just the way that I am, but also because book 3 is, again, its own romance, its own standalone romance, but also it's an ensemble book. So book 3 is when you finally have all the characters on page at once. And my God, it was such a headache. So moving from A Marvellous Light to A Restless Truth was moving from having 2 characters who are really like the core of the story, moving through the world, to having 2 characters and then 2 supporting characters, which, you're right, is about the perfect amount to juggle a central romance while also having some supporting characters contributing to the plot. And then I hit book 3, which has 2 narrators, a central romance, and basically 7 protagonists.
Oh no.
And went, what the fuck have I done to myself?
It's gonna be so good, but I'm so sorry.
It was so much fun. And I was like, how does Leverage do this? Because what I had essentially done was assemble a found family of a Leverage heist crew for book 3. And I'm like, how do they manage it? And the reason they can do it is they just constantly split the group up into little 2s and 3s. Yeah. So they can have little conversations. And so I could do that, but I had to make sure one of the 2s and 3s was one of the narrators at all times.
They're a TV show and you have to do interiority.
I have to do all of the interiority myself. So yeah, book 3 coming next year. We won't talk more about that.
Book 3 can be 300,000 words. So there you are. There is appetite for more.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you said that like we're both writing queer norm worlds, because the point of writing this historical fantasy was I didn't really want to explore in great detail the structural and societal homophobia of Edwardian England, which was definitely there. But I wanted you to feel that when these people are together, they are creating their own little queer norm world, because they have found a society of like-minded people and they can be entirely themselves in a way that they can't when they are existing within the society, which was fun, but also means that they just talk and talk and talk and talk, and you end up with very long books.
But it's so good. Yeah, I think that thing of, I think it's really interesting that, so we're certainly not the only people writing queer norm. There are a lot of people writing for, you know, various reasons, worlds in which homophobia is not something that is dealt with, and this is not at all talked about because it is normal for that society. And it's a way of saying, you know, what if there were problems but homophobia wasn't one of them. I think it is really interesting that in a lot of these books we are still talking about our own worlds. We are still in some ways talking about breaking boundaries in order to have a relationship, which of course is a trope in male female romance as well, in the wider romance genre. But it is I think it's very clear that there are often family boundaries, there are often social boundaries. In Ocean's Echo, like, I have made up a psychic social boundary in order to break that down. Like, it's very much about, it's about the the way in which society is forcing you to be, and showing how being forced into something that is not good for you is, you know, an issue with this society, but of course also by transient property, an issue with the wider society. And it is about how you consent to relationships within that, and how you actively involve yourself in relationships or break off ones that are not working for you, and about how you are able to kind of spot your own choices and then make them, if that makes sense. Like the choices you end up making later in the book are not necessarily even options that you saw earlier in the book. I think that's
all of my characters are a product of a homophobic society, but I didn't want them to be struggling too much with internalization of the forces that had shaped them. So for me, the whole point of that was showing that in this time, there were people who found self-acceptance and happiness and romance and lived their lives happily. But also, if you are writing historical queer romance and you are acknowledging the accuracy of the homophobic forces of that time, the need for secrecy becomes its own kind of pressure cooker. Like it's its own forced proximity, because you are giving these people a relationship that by necessity has to be kept secret from the wider world. And then of course, like you want to give people community as well. And so the way you do that is you surround them with other people. So just like in today's world, we queers tend to hang out in packs because you have found a community that in which you can be yourself and express your truth of your gender, your sexuality, of the people that you love. And that creates for really compelling storytelling. And I think it is why we're seeing so much of this found family trope in queer science fiction and fantasy, especially.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the thing of, if you have that community, you then are able to tell a story about that community that is not necessarily about homophobia, even though, you know, it is in the background. Sorry, I'm switching between Ocean's Echo, Restless Truth, and got confused. But yeah, you have that we recognize each other, not just as, so there are other queer people who exist in the world, and they are not necessarily romantic partners. They're not even people we are considering as romantic partners. They are just other queer people who we may think of as friends, or honestly we may think of as enemies. Like finally there are enough queer people in the cast that they can fill all roles. So you're not actually thinking about, you know, is this person good queer representation? Because actually you have lots of people doing lots of different representations.
Exactly.
And like some of them may be very bad people.
I don't want anybody to look at Tennant or at Maud and be like, oh yes,
yeah,
a role model.
Role model.
No. Don't make decisions like these people.
No. And I think of the quote for a book: listen very carefully to what I say, then do the exact opposite. Are we coming to question time? Do we have time?
I wanted to talk just a teensy little bit though about that. Yes, the point about the fact that we have now for both of us, this is book 2, and for me it is book 2 in a series. For you, it is the second book in an established universe. And how did you approach which parts of the universe to explore next, and building on an established world? How did that affect
this one is really interesting.
Writing?
Okay, yeah, so for those of you who have read Winter's Orbit, you will know that Winter's Orbit takes place on a planet that it's an empire of 7 planets, and it seems very important to the people who are on it, and it has like a lot of politics, and it is the stakes are very high within that empire in Winter's Orbit. But there are some hints in the book, and I think it's outright stated in Winter's Orbit, that actually the wider galaxy considers the Iska Empire to be something of a backwater. Because I have the structure that is that has absolutely been used many times, which is a wide galaxy linked by very fast travel, but also some wormholes, and the wormholes are in fixed places, so they are basically portals, and the conceit of the Iska Empire is that it is a year away from the nearest wormhole, and that means that people don't really travel through the wormhole to the wider galaxy very much, because it's a year away. That's 2 years of your life just to get to the nearest planet that is not in your sector. And the thing I really like about that is it then it implies a much wider universe. So you have basically kind of infinite planets, infinite combinations, and you have this kind of galactic body that is like in a hands-off way regulating what goes on, though largely they're regulating these kind of semi-magic alien remnants. They're regulating the use of those. They don't really care about internal politics. So for my next book, I set it on the other side of the galaxy, on a completely different planet that doesn't really talk to its character. It's kind of the backwater. So I was able to do a whole different society, and lots of sort of new things. And one of the things I was able to do was say, okay, we had some remnants in the last book. They did some weird things. What if they have done even weirder things over here? And this planet is still dealing with that. So in this book, we find out a little bit more about the remnants. We find out a little bit more about where they came from, but not in a way that answers all questions. And I hope to be able to continue to write in this universe, potentially with some of the things I have mentioned in these. I really like kind of mentioning something in one book and having more about it in my mind and thinking, okay, maybe one day we will go there. We will spend 140,000 words or less there doing that. So for me, it was kind of that expansion of the world. And you went to another country. That was that genuinely surprised me. I hadn't even thought America would exist in A Marvellous Light. This is because I'm British.
No, it's because the characters in A Marvellous Light just don't think about that at all. So the way I approach world building is essentially create the bits that you need, and for everything else, just assume that it's there and you can go there if you need it. So I don't know in my own head a great deal about how magic differs in England versus in America, but I know a few bits. And I wanted to give this sense that the world that we see in A Marvellous Light is so influenced by the people we are seeing it through. And Edwin is somebody who has a theoretical knowledge of the fact that magic is practiced differently in different places, but he's never been there. He doesn't have anybody to correspond with about it. So all of his knowledge just comes from books he's read. And even in A Marvellous Light, there is an acknowledgement that the books he's read are influenced by the people who wrote the books and their feelings about things like colonies. And so in A Restless Truth, I did want to show that you've now got a character who has spent some time in a different country and is coming back. And so she has been exposed to a lot of other ways of doing magic and new types of spells. And that influences the way she now sees British magic and the way British magicians see her. And that was really fun, just to put in a little bit of a hint of other things, even if it's just a dropped line about the fact that she met somebody whose family did mute magic by singing, but they have lost the traditions of it because their ancestors were enslaved in America. And just a hint that there is a bigger world and not everybody runs by the same rules, and the sources of magic in other countries might be different as well, because the whole central preoccupation of this is, where did magic in Britain come from, and how is that influencing how it can be used and abused? So for me, I really enjoyed showing more of what you can do with the magic, while hinting at an even bigger world that I don't know the answers to. So I don't know if you know where your alien remnants come from yet, or if you have answered all of your questions.
I know.
A little bit, yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way to approach something where you're going to be playing for a while in the same world, is to just, when you need to do something, turn around, shine a torch in the other direction, and walk, and just say, okay, what can I find over here? And you've left yourself these amazing crumbs and remnants that you can then start to build on. But I didn't want to provide all the answers. I wanted to preserve that sense of wonder and that sense of us existing in a larger world and only really seeing what we see because of the characters through whose eyes we're looking.
I really like the metaphor of shining a torch in a direction and just setting off there, see what happens.
Yeah, you just describe the shit that the light's on, and then there's some stuff hiding in the darkness, and you'll get to it if you need it.
You'll shine a torch to different places if you need to, and it might be horrifying, who knows?
Yeah, that could be where the sea monsters are. We don't know.
We need some sea monsters somewhere. Cool. Elizabeth, should we go to Q&A?
Yeah.
We are back. Audience members, some of you have already been putting questions in the chat sidebar. If you do have questions, pop them in there. We'll get to as many as we can. I'll start with this one from Megan. For Freya, will you ever write a book about the older generations of ladies? Their magic sounds so cool, and I'd love to read about how they met each other and taught themselves their craft and tracked down all the objects.
All right. Megan, I'm going to assume you have not yet read A Restless Truth. Of all the books in the series, this is the one that is the most preoccupied with that generation and those women. So the Forsythia Club, who is the old ladies who found the last contract in the first place and then discovered its potential for misuse. This book has a lot to do with them in ways that I am not going to spoil, but you do get a segment of the book that is almost like a flashback to how they met and how they got started and what kind of people they were. And that's really integral to the book of A Restless Truth. So I hope you enjoy that aspect.
And also from Megan for Everina, I loved Janum and Tyam's relationship so much. Will we see more of them in future books?
I'm going to take that as TM, and I'm really sorry that I keep inventing totally made up strings of letters, which are not actually nice. I'm still going to assume that's John and Kiet. Yeah, so they're not in Ocean's Echo. It is possible that they will pop up in future books, largely because that's what I really like having worlds where it is all taking place in the same time and in the same like general area, so other people like could turn up. So I don't actually know what the next one is going to be yet. We are still in that stage, so it's not currently planned to be a direct sequel, but yeah, it is possible. There is also, for people who pre-ordered, there was also a short story for Kim and Jonan. I am looking into like eventually making that available more widely. So yeah, currently they are on a well-earned vacation, and I'll imagine them there.
Let's see. Sarah asks, what's your favorite underused romance trope? I am a fan of the grumpy one and the soft one, and the sunshine one, which has been used excellently by both of you. But what is your favorite underutilized trope?
Oh, that's a tricky one.
The ones that I really like are not obscure. They get used quite a lot. I'm trying to think of anything that I would think of as obscure that I really like. I think there is. I don't think it's underutilized, but I do really like a good rivals to lovers, like people who have something really in common, but the only thing they have in common is their shared obsession with a pastime or a sport or something, and they both want the same thing, because you have inbuilt something in common. They have to at least be slightly similar, inbuilt reason to hate each other, inbuilt proximity, and inbuilt tension of both wanting the same thing, so it really being a bit of a zero-sum game. And I think when that's done well, it is very satisfying.
Yeah, I think the crucial thing for me in that is this: they have to pay attention to each other. Like that's this whole thing that boils down to, it's very romantic to be totally paying attention to someone else. Like that.
I think sports anime does that really well. Like I will learn everything about this person's moves. I will memorize everything about them.
For sport.
That's a bit romantic. Just for sports reasons. Yeah.
Just for sports reasons. Yeah, I think I don't know what's underused, to be honest. Like I'm sure there are many books about any trope I could name. I come back to competence all the time. I come back to two people who just are very good at something and really admire that about each other, and they're good at different things and they make each other better. I just keep coming back to that.
While we stay on the subject of tropes, I like to ask, what is your favorite trope to read and your favorite trope to write? Because they are not always the same thing.
This is going to take too much thought. Can we? I need to have a long think about this one.
Back to this, or this will be a tweet addendum. All right.
Yeah, circle back.
All right. Someone asked, how do you think a meeting between the main characters of Ocean's Echo and A Restless Truth would go? There's a parallel question from Jessica, says, if a character from each of your books had to live in the other's world, which character do you think would adapt the best?
This is hilarious because we've actually talked about this. Yeah, we have opinions on this. So the thing is that Maud in A Restless Truth, I don't know if this has come through from the panel so far, but Maud is basically like a young, naive ingenue with the soul of a retired general. Like she is leading the troops into battle, and the troops that she has are like a ragtag group of various mages on a ship. But she would be leading troops into battle wherever she was. So I think she would be terrifying in Ocean's Echo, where she would actually have troops to lead into battle, where, you know, people with military skills tend to end up in the military. So yeah, more than Ocean's Echo would be, you know, retired general very, very quickly, active general very, very quickly. Tennel in Restless Truth would be having a great time, but nobody else would. He would be, you know, it would be a 6-day party. And that's fine, you know, someone has died, but
and I think if Violet had met him on day 1 of the voyage, then
she
would just,
bad combination.
It would be absolutely terrifying. I'm pretty sure, they would just have a 6-day rager in somewhere on the ship, and everything would be in shambles.
Yeah, nobody would notice that someone had died. That would be the
because the last thing that Tennel needs is somebody who says yes and. Oh, that would be awful. So funny.
You've both talked about both novels being a book 2 in some way, either second in a series or second in a world. Do you find yourself missing your book 1 characters when you're in the same world or universe, but looking through someone else's eyes?
I didn't really have time. I was going to say, I didn't really have time to miss them because Maud is thinking about them a lot. So when I was writing this book, they are very prominent in sort of the negative space of how Maud approaches the world and thinks about magic, because everything she knows comes from what she has learned from Edwin, and Robin was obviously the predominant positive force in her life. So whenever I missed them, I just had Maud think about them. And then also just anticipate how it was going to be when they finally met the other characters, because I knew I would be bringing them back for book 3. So for me, it wasn't so much I really wish I was back with them. It was look at all this bullshit I'm building that I'm then going to dump on their doorstep. That's going to be fun.
Yeah, I think I have a different situation. So I've got kind of 2 bubbles in a way. So I've got 2 very different societies. So actually, there's no way that Kiem will be having a reaction to something that Tennel is seeing, because he lives in a very different society with a different set of kind of rules and principles. I think sometimes I do, like, some characters I find very easy to write, and Kiem and Tennel are 2 of those, because in their own ways they generate plot very, very, very fast. You just put them in a situation and they say something outrageous and then they just go and go and go and go. I think Tennel is a little harder in that he is always pushing, and he is always coming up with kind of a 90-degree solution, which means that I have to come up with a 90-degree solution. Whereas Kiem is very much, I'm going to have a great time having a conversation with you, and then I'm going to go off and do something totally unhinged. In some ways that's easier, but so I guess I'm missing a bit. Yeah.
We have a question from Joe, who has championed Freya's books in our store hard. Joe says, I know Freya writes fan fiction, and Everina referenced fandom earlier in this conversation. How does fandom and fan fiction influence the way you each write romance?
So I think for me, when I started writing, romance was my worst skill set, which was quite interesting, because this was, back when I was a teenager. I had learned some stuff about world building, I'd learned some stuff about characterization and plot. I was very, very bad at romance. And I think what fan fiction taught me to do was write a certain kind of romance, which is a romance that is very uniquely rooted in character. So, and again, I don't want to say that mainstream romance doesn't do this, because of course it absolutely does. But for me, fan fiction is very particularly saying, okay, these 2 people have very, very distinct characters. They have to stay in character, but also we want to see how a romance would develop between them. So in the best kind of fan fiction, which I was kind of seeking out to try and read, you have different types of romance happening each time. Like in the best fan fiction, you cannot mistake it for literally anything else. It has to be only these 2. If you put any other names on it, it wouldn't work, because they are very much rooted in their context and where they're coming from. And that means you get this kind of infinite variety of how 2 people fit together and yet very much keep their core selves. And I really kind of credit that with eventually, like, how I started getting into romance is one of my main skill sets, which is this whole thing is infinitely interesting. You're never doing the same thing twice.
I completely agree. I think that's one of the things that fan fiction does really well, is that it really makes it clear what is it about these two people's romance that is compelling. Because if you just read so many iterations of it, you really see what is it that has captured the imagination of fandom. And if you are then trying to create original characters and you want to reach readers and create this emotional connection and make them have very strong feelings about how much they need the action figures to smush together and kiss, how do you do that? Like, what do people respond to in a pairing? And reading a lot of fan fiction for me also helped me distill what I enjoy in a romance. And then when I was writing fan fiction, it was me exploring how do I start writing some of these tropes that I really like, because I came to genre romance through fan fiction, realizing that I was seeking out these stories and I enjoyed reading them and I enjoyed writing them. And then I was like, oh, where is all of this stuff in traditional publishing? And then I rocked off into traditional romance and had a really good time. So for me, it was partly about learning how to distill a romance down into real character notes, and partly about, well, what do I like? Which tropes do I enjoy? And how do I put them together?
We have time for just a few more questions. I will remind our audience members, if you do not yet already have the books, Gibson's Bookstore is happily selling these books. We happily ship to you, and we are including signed book plates in with our books. A reminder that Freya Marske is the author of A Marvellous Light and the new and lovely A Restless Truth, and Everina Maxwell is the author of Winter's Orbit and now Ocean's Echo. We have a question from Jamie saying, question for both of you. Do you have plans to have any trans or non-binary main characters?
At the moment, there's one of the books that I'm thinking about for my next full-length fantasy project. It is much more of an ensemble book. It has a few different main characters, and at the moment I'm thinking that one of them I think is probably non-binary. If it comes to writing books that is just one narrator or even two narrators, I think I would want to sit down and think, am I the right person as a cis person to be telling that story? And there's so many great books out there that I could be championing instead. But I think when it comes to books that have a slightly wider cast, I do want to show the diversity that exists in the human experience. So at the moment, probably yes, as part of an ensemble group.
So yeah, for me, a lot of thoughts about this one. Not all of which so when you are, so I've been thinking about non-binary main characters quite hard. There is as I'm sure you're all aware, there is a spotlight that comes with writing a character of marginalization. That there is, especially with queer identities, that I think we've seen very recently, which is that there is a pressure to be quite sure about who you are in yourself, that not necessarily all authors are kind of at that point. So I am thinking very hard about non-binary main characters. I hope to be able to share more of that kind of journey and book process in years to come. So the other kind of less thorny part is that in the Winter's Orbit and Ocean's Echo, it is explicitly trans inclusive, in that most people's kind of assigned genders at birth are not mentioned because they're not relevant, because that's not how these far-future societies define gender. And no one system of invented societal gender is going to work for everyone. Of course, Ocean's Echo and Winter's Orbit only kind of propose one, and also propose a lot of variations within that one. So it's not supposed to be a utopia, nothing's going to fit everybody. But it is explicitly very easy to change the gender you are perceived as, or more precisely the pronouns you are referred to with, is not the same thing, by changing certain ornamentation, and you can basically be asking for some pronouns one day and switch those the next day, without it being a major thing. There is very easy societal way of doing this. So in some ways, there is no kind of explicitly trans or cis definition for most of the side characters, because you just wouldn't know. This is a society that does not have certain hang-ups. It has other hang-ups. That said, sometimes you do get to know people. There is a explicitly trans side character in Ocean's Echo. But yeah, main characters, come back to me in a few years and we'll see what I've written.
Right.
Watch this space.
So that also half answered one of our last questions of how did you come up with the ornamentation identification system, which everybody has agreed in the sidebar, like they love that very clever aspect of Winter's orbit. There is another question here though as well, which I think might be our last question for the evening. So I will thank everybody first for attending. This has been a lot of fun. Tell your friends to buy and read these books because they're delightful. I'm going to ask you, Freya and Everina, who would you fan cast in a TV show or movie? Do you have any dream actor casting? I'm a little bit face blind. I just want Tom Hiddleston for everything. So any thoughts?
So I'm gonna go first. I don't have an answer, and that's gonna be a bad note to end on. I am so face blind that anyone remember the movie Ocean's 8, which is not Ocean's Echo. There's one point where one of the main characters, possibly Sandra Bullock or it's possibly the other one, puts on a wig, and the wig is the same color as the other main character's hair. And for 15 minutes in the middle of a movie that I had already been watching for 1 whole hour, I thought she was the other main character, and I was so confused. And we spent like 20 minutes me unpicking, but she's blonde. So I am that face blind. So yeah.
I don't often feel like I need to have a very clear face in my head for the characters. I need to have a few identifying features and a sense of how they move through the world and what other people would notice about them, but I don't need to base them on somebody in particular. And if I was casting something today, I have no idea whatsoever. But I will say that there are a lot of pictures of a very young Helena Bonham Carter in Edwardian gear, because she was in like all of the E.M. Forster adaptations that Merchant Ivory did. And she's a pretty close fit for Maud.
Okay.
Just that sense of wide-eyed, fresh face, discovering the world, and then you just, bang, add chaos. That's Maud.
And you could film it on the Titanic sets. Even though it's definitely not the Titanic. It's
definitely not the Titanic. No, I definitely didn't steal a great deal of interior design specs from the much detail that is out there about the Titanic.
I will throw in one last question, and that is, what are you working on? Are there any details you can give us for your next piece? Freya, I desperately want to ask who the pairing is going to be in the third book. You probably can't tell us.
I won't tell you because it is a bit of a spoiler for book 2 if people haven't read it. So you can ask me afterwards when we stop recording.
I will say, if you read book 2, you might have a good idea who it's going to be.
Yes, exactly. Like it's very difficult, I think, to come out of book 2 without a fairly good idea of who the pairing is going to be in book 3. But I don't want to spoil.
It's also a very, very Freya pairing. Book 3 is the most possible Freya pairing that Freya could have written.
That is absolutely correct. Everina knows me way too well.
Okay, and Everina, what are you working on next? So I don't actually have any details to share about the next thing at the moment. There will be something eventually next. But I did want to shout about another book I'm reading that comes out next, I think April, which is Some Desperate Glory by Emily Tesh, which is out from Tor.com in again, I think April. It is an incredible dark space opera about a girl who is raised in a kind of space cult about the last of the humans. Humans have been nearly wiped from the face of this kind of alien universe, and the horrendous kind of closeted ideas she's growing up with, and then the way she escapes from this kind of military space cult and starts to see the wider universe, but is still very much indoctrinated in her mind, and then how that gradually kind of unfolds. It is a thriller. It is action-packed page to page. I love it. I keep thinking about it, and I probably can't reread it because it is like too intense.
I completely second that. We could have probably sat here for another half hour and just talked about Some Desperate Glory, but it is incredible.
All right. Well, that's the end of our evening, or Freya, the beginning of your morning. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I don't think we can actually do a green room afterwards, but Freya, I will message you because I am desperate.
Look, your guess is probably correct, but
Okay.
just you can message me and I'll let you know.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. This has been an absolute delight. Happy reading, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.